Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeremy Weinstein. I'm a professor of political science and the director of Stanford Global Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual Global Studies student dinner. We have gathered together all of the different centers and programs that we have for undergraduate students and graduate students on campus, gathered together in one room with some of the really inspiring students that are associated with each center and program. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring people together under one roof to talk about important issues of our time, and we're really blessed with an extraordinary speaker who Alberto Diaz-Cayeros, the head of the Center for Latin American Studies, will introduce in a second. But I appreciate people spending dinner with us tonight and giving us an opportunity to share our thoughts and perspectives in this kind of setting. The introduction tonight is going to come from Alberto Diaz-Cayeros. Where are you sitting? There, he's right there. He's the director of our Center for Latin American Studies, a senior fellow at FSI, and has been a colleague of mine for a long time on campus. He took a detour down to UCSD to direct the Center for US and Mexico there for 5 years, and then we got him back to Stanford a number of years ago. He's an extraordinary scholar of Latin American politics, has worked on a wide variety of issues, from governance issues to indigenous development issues to health over the long term to issues of crime and violence. And we're extraordinarily lucky to have him as a colleague on campus, a mentor to students, and the leader of the Center for Latin American Studies. And since class has played an extraordinary role in bringing our distinguished speaker tonight, I wanted to ask Alberto to do the formal introduction. So please join me in welcoming Alberto.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'll try to be very brief. I'm very happy to be here today, also because I do think that in the time that we have, in the U.S. today, if we don't look outside and look to the international dimension, regardless of whether it's Latin America, Asia, Africa, the world is going to take us by surprise. So we'd better be ready, and I think you are, in different ways, the ones who are going to be ready for that. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. To me, it is really incredible to be able to invite Ricardo Raphael here as our speaker. He's a dear friend, but more important than that, he's a true intellectual. You probably don't realize this, but it is not very common that you will find the kind of career and the kind of path that Ricardo has taken, being a political scientist by profession, but actually doing things as his passions and as his interest in learning about the world around him took him in different directions. So when you look at his bio, you might think, oh, maybe he's a news anchor. So he has a TV show and a very important radio show. He does these interviews and things like that. So he's a public figure in Mexican media. But then you look a little bit later and you see the bio and you see, oh, he has written a book on the most corrupt teachers union leader in Mexico who was in jail, and he wrote the kind of the definite journalism story about this book. But he also wrote this other book, which happens to be my favorite, the El Otro México, which is a book about what was happening in the north of Mexico. It's a travelogue as he started realizing that something really important and very difficult to understand was going around in the country with the drug traffickers and the social malaise and the kind of the Durkheimian anomie. And he decided to travel to try to figure out what was going on. He founded a school of journalism in CIDE. But in his heart, I would have to say, he's still passionate about using kind of the power of social science, the power of words, the power of our minds to be able to think about these very difficult problems and to bring those problems into action. So that's what I wanted to say about him. You have his bio in the back, but thank you for coming here, Ricardo, with a lot of admiration and cariño.
Thank you, Alberto, very much for the presentation. I mean, I feel more like an opportunistic on epistemology because when you live in Mexico, you need many skills, a lot of knowledge to understand what is going on. So, yes, in academia, journalism, whatever is needed to face what we are dealing. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much, Alberto. And thank you, all of you, for allowing me to share some thoughts during this annual student dinner about my country and as well about my job. The theme I desire to discuss with you this afternoon is how Mexican press and journalism is facing threats that has to do with global origins, and I would say what has to do with what we call today the post-truth politics. It's difficult today, it's a difficult task to investigating and to tell what journalists are investigating. Real facts in Mexico have a lot of problems with corruption, with violence. And I couldn't say that what is happening in Mexico is just an exception. Instead, I need you to think in my country as an example of what is happening in a global contemporary times about media and about freedom of expression. What is called now the post-truth or post-factual politics impact differently across the globe, across country, but share similar origins and causes. Technological changes and radical shifts in power are affecting seriously the way we express and we use freedom. All the new threats are inhibiting and reducing our freedom of expression. I like to think this in the way Michel Foucault used to do it back in the 80s when he gave an historical lecture at the University of California in Berkeley. He called it the fearless speech. This is what I want to talk about fearless speech in Mexico. According to this French sociologist, fearless speech, or the courage to speak truly, is not just an individual feature. It's more like a social one. Indeed, fearless speech is an attribute of the community we live in and we build every day. But it's not just a virtue of a single human being. If I am forced to characterize today's Mexico situation about freedom of press or freedom of expression, I have to say we Mexicans live in times of timid speech, or worse, of cowardly speech. I hope you understand I'm not talking about myself or about my colleagues, but about the public sphere we share in the present time. I am talking about the context in which we have to do our job as journalists. Tonight I will mainly focus on two aspects of this public sphere. First, as I said, the threats against free press related to violence and organized crime, and the threats linked to government corruption. I start with the first one, with two little stories. Very in the morning on March 23rd last year, the body of Miroslava Breach, a well-known journalist from the state of Chihuahua, age 54, was found inside her car with multiple shots. She was investigating criminal organizations, one criminal organization called Los Salazar. This crime organization was linked to the cartel of Sinaloa, formerly led by El Chapo Guzman. On May 16, last year as well, another famous journalist, Javier Valdez, received 12 shots just before lunchtime when he was crossing the street of his home. He won the Maria Cabot Award for his drug trafficking investigation in Sinaloa. He was a very important figure for us, for journalists. 1 year later, neither Miroslava nor Javier cases have seen justice. This is exactly the same situation of more than 110 Mexican journalists who lost their lives during the past 18 years. During the Enrique Peña, our actual former president administration, 39 journalists lost their lives, were assassinated. After Syria, where there is an actual war, Mexico is the country where it's most dangerous to be a journalist. Last year, 39 journalists were murdered around the world. 11 of them were murdered in Mexico, while 12 were murdered in Syria. Besides homicides, there's other kind of threats: disappearance, physical attacks, acts of intimidation. According to the organization Article 19, Mexican chapter, there is an aggression against journalists every 16 hours in Mexico. Most threats come from Veracruz, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Chihuahua, and Oaxaca. What do we know about these threats? Well, almost all of them occurred in regions where violence is related to organized crime. Nonetheless, each region, each city shows different patterns. I have been interviewing colleagues during the past 5 or 6 years, and one of them, Sandra Rodriguez, a reporter from Ciudad Juarez, once told me a very accurate explanation. She said, in Juarez, you can report anything, whatever you want. A dead body, shooting on the street, street fight. Because if you do not report, El Paso Times will do it. So organized crime is coming with that. But it is forbidden to investigate why the guy was dead or why the shooters were there. So you can report, you can't investigate. If you move to Sinaloa, if you go to Sinaloa, things are different. Their reporters only can report about what happened with one of the cartels, but never about the other if you want to still alive. In Tamaulipas, there is no way you can report. Silence is the one and single law journalists have to respect. Second thing that we know, most aggressions against journalists do not come from leaders of drug cartels, but from public officials related to criminal organizations that are investigated by journalists. 6 out of 10 threats come from corrupt public officials. Third, the judiciary system has been unable to resolve most cases. And fourth, there's a kind of fracture between the national media and the local media that doesn't help, that doesn't bring solidarity to fight together all journalists against organized crime. crime, we see indeed lack of solidarity. So this is the first picture I wanted to share with you. Now I move to the other threat that has to do with the government corruption. I worked for 20 years, it was my very first job as journalist, in a radio show called Enfoque. And after 20 years, you become friend with the owner. If not you are easily fired. The owner is an old man, 82, Gilberto Huesca, that I presume he was my friend. Every 3 or 4 months, we had a breakfast at the same place, and we had it in a very modest restaurant. And one day, in February 2017, he asked me to meet him in a very fancy restaurant with a French name on it, Au Pied de Cochon, where many politicians go. And I was surprised because usually this was not the kind of place where we meet each other. So I started to smell something that I didn't like it. And as soon as I sat there, I noticed he was very angry. And he went straight to the point. He said, 350 people work for my radio station, and you are putting their way of living at risk. I said, sorry, Mr. Huesca, is the government complaining about me? And he said yes. I received a phone call from the president's office informing that government ads for his radio station will be reduced considerably because of a so-called change on internal policy. He replied, he said, well, but I need this money, and it's so sudden. And this public official said, Mr. Huesca, you have not been very loyal as you were supposed to be. Loyal how? He asked. For example, you have in your weekly daily debate Mrs. Casar and Mr. Raphael, who are hardly critic against Peña's administration. I wanted to know how did he react. And he said, well, Mr. Raphael, I decided I no longer want analysis during the news program. Since now I just want from you to deliver information. And I said, information without analysis during the electoral year? And he said, yes. Well, end of the conversation, and of 20 years of my life in this radio station. In Mexico, freedom of expression is at risk because government can exchange ads for silence. Use the discretion to use state funds to assure press obedience. The problem is that government ads are neither regulated nor transparent, and then they are manipulated for political purposes. Government advertising overdose, I could say, is bringing diabetes to the media and to journalism. How big is this problem? Around $5 billion coming from the taxpayers and poured to the media during every 5 years. $5 billion. So they can have a positive coverage and editorial influence as a part of the exchange. The problem is bigger because, as I was saying, this is not just a Mexican phenomenon. The old business model of the media enterprises is in crisis. Since private advertising moved away from traditional media to Google and to Facebook and other kind of platforms. 60% of private advertising moved out from traditional news to other platforms. Revenues for TV, for radio news dropped dramatically, and worse things, as you know, happened to print news. Nonetheless, and this is different if you see what's going on in the States and other countries, in Mexico, all these companies have survived thanks to government subsidies. If overnight, Mexican government stop to pour money into the media, they will be not media at all. So now, as you can see in the discussion in the Senate, we're discussing a piece of legislation for regulating government ads. And nobody knows what's going to happen. But we need transparency because this is the other big threat. I would say it's not the same threat that Javier Valdez or Miroslava faced. It's a very fancy threat that I received in a very fancy restaurant. But both things together are creating this kind of timid or coward speech I was talking about. I talked with my son before coming here, and he said that there are very young people there. Be optimistic. Now I have to call him and say that it was not possible. I try to be honest. Nonetheless, I would say that I am seeing things that help me to understand the next step for media and freedom of expression in Mexico. As Alberto said, I was the director of a master program in journalism for 5 years. I founded this program and I was director for 5 years. And I was surprised because all this information I'm giving to you was already there. After hearing what I am saying, you say, why a young guy or young lady want to be journalist? It's not rational. And what I am seeing is more and more people wanting to be journalists. There is not a good salary. There is no good job. But we need to fight this post-truth, post-fact life that we are living. And there's just one way to do it. Doing more journalism, better journalism, rigorous journalism. And I would say that this is the reason why vocations is growing for journalism. There's another shift that is important. More and more women are entering news media. 60% of reporters today in Mexico are women. Why? You have to ask. They are not directors. They are not in the top level, but they will be. And the third thing that I am seeing is a lot better journalism. Pieces of corruption and organized crime that are great at the top level. And I can imagine that we are living, or I want to think that we are living the Middle Ages of journalism. And we are entering the Renaissance. It's not an easy path, it's difficult. But we need to build a society with fearless speech. And so it's worthy to be a journalist. Thank you very much for hearing me this time.
So your son clearly got to you. You ended with an optimistic message. One of the reasons I think we thought this was such an important topic to bring to the group tonight, this year, as part of our annual dinner, is that the problems and challenges that Ricardo is confronting in Mexico are by no means limited to Mexico. And I think for all the different parts of the world that are represented in this community that we bring together, sadly, these are familiar stories. They're increasingly familiar stories in the United States as well. And what we're seeing with the press is not the only domain in which this kind of crackdown on some of the basic freedoms that we take for granted and have taken for granted in the United States are being experienced, right? Crackdowns on the freedom, not just of expression, but of association. And so I think as we turn from Ricardo's remarks to our own conversations over dinner, I think there's a lot to reflect on about the challenges that we confront in each of the regions that we study and how we think about maintaining optimism and what next steps look like to maintain these really important and central rights. What we'll do now is we'll eat and we'll talk amongst ourselves, and each table has extraordinary students and our faculty directors with us tonight, and then Alberto and Ricardo will have a Q&A. Alberto will start it off, but then we'll open it up to the group. So think about what questions you might have for Ricardo, and we'll come back together after we do some eating. So thank you.
I know you're all enjoying very much your conversations, but I do want to profit from the possibility of asking some questions to Ricardo. I do want to open it up very quickly for you to ask questions, but I want to ask him, a couple of things to just get us warmed up. So one of the questions I wanted to ask him is, that in a way, it's not difficult to imagine media being in some ways harassed and subject to a lot of pressure from governments when you are in an authoritarian regime. If you are in a dictatorship, well, media has its job really curtailed in many ways, and its freedoms, are. But Mexico is really a solid democracy. It is a true democracy. It is an electoral democracy. Elections happen, even with small margins of victory. Somebody is declared victorious, somebody loses. The loser might be sore and angry, but eventually things seem to be working quite well in Mexican democracy. So how can this Mexican democracy, be treating the journalists the way you just described us?
I wouldn't dare to say that our democracy has is in good shape. Because we follow a path for democracy that is different. If you see most countries that did this transition at the same time, I would say that in Mexico we are slow learners, like the US or like Great Britain. They start to be democratic, but the path was, a civil war in the middle, and a lot of authoritarian things that were falling down. We are not suddenly democratic. We are becoming democratic. And saying that, I would say that we look democratic at the national level. So you see many parties, you see fair elections, you see authorities that must be transparent. But when you look at the local level, we are as authoritarian as we were. And we are a federal system, so there are states that are more authoritarian than the others. And if you add to this corruption that links organized crime with elected authorities, you have a nightmare. You have a big problem. So who are the journalists that are being threatened or murdered? Or the journalists that investigated at the local level. The worst that happened to me, as I said, is a meal in a fancy French place. But the journalist that is doing investigation in Tamaulipas, in Chihuahua, there is a problem. I hope that what we are seeing at the national level gonna one day to be the reality at the local level, and that can change. But about federalism, you know more than me.
Let me ask you a second question, since you touched upon the question of corruption. And I should mention that Ricardo was making me feel very guilty yesterday night, saying that I really have to write more on federalism. So mea culpa for not doing more of my due diligence on that topic. But the moment when you're fired, I mean, you're not fired. You're basically asked to leave. And it is a very, for those of you who did not follow all these Mexican events, it was a very prominent thing that happened in the media. These were two very important public figures, Ricardo and María Amparo Casar, whom he mentioned. María Amparo, in fact, is right now the face of the anti-corruption fight in Mexico. I should also say, since this is Stanford, all of that effort, practical all of that effort is being funded by a Stanford alumni who is a businessman in Mexico. But when María Amparo and you are fired, sort of lose your jobs, and the news anchor also resigns as a protest, why was there no more kind of public outrage, more public indignation? Why, could the government kind of prevent, things in the streets, or people being really saying, we take this as our rallying cry to think about the anti-corruption? I mean, it was about the president's White House. I mean, this $1 million house given by a construction company to the wife of the president.
Yeah, we were not the first. I think the case of Carmen Aristegui, that happened 2 years before what happened to us, was worse. I mean, she and her team investigated president's corruption, conflict of interest, and after that, a real corruption discussion started in Mexico. I mean, we are now talking about corruption because of this investigation. So indignation is already there, but we know that this government is leaving. What I presume is that we were the last fired. And now I think it's evident. It was a big error of my friend Huesca and from government. The scandal was enough. And after that, we don't know any other journalist that is losing his job. And on the other hand, it's kind of difficult to explain that, but I wanna talk not about what Curcio or Casar think, but what I think. I don't think that journalists should be news. I mean, it's like a photographer. Imagine that the photographer puts himself between the camera and the landscape. You don't see the landscape. So we protested. I wrote 3 columns about it. It was a new, very interesting article here in the New York Times. It was a scandal of 2 weeks. But after that, you need to move out. And I think it was very expensive. We are now expecting that things going to change with the change of the government. I hope that's going to happen. I'm not sure.
Let's open up to questions from the audience. I know there's at least one on that table, but there might be some questions if you want to ask, either about the talk or about Mexico. Yes, please go ahead. Shall I? Maybe also tell us who you are and what program.
In the case of Korea, we also experienced a lot of pressure on the journalism during the 1970s and 80s because of the dictatorship under the very severe authoritarian regimes. But in our case, we overcame those pressures by a massive nationwide demonstrations, which was happened in the 1989. And from that point, we kind of achieved a real democracy. And as you may heard about our last year's, people's demonstration to, kicked out of our former President Park Geun-hye, we kind of like had experienced a lot of that kind of grassroots demonstrations against the corruption or any authoritarian regime. So I wonder whether in Mexico, whether there is any grassroots movement similar to what we Koreans have experienced to overcome your problem.
What you're gonna see? Do I take several questions or I answer each? Which is the
One by one, no?
by one?
Yeah, yeah.
One by one. Okay.
Just do them brief. So
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, what I can say is that what you see is growth, enormous growth on civil rights or civil organizations. I mean, it's incredible. Overall, in the cities or the regions where more violence do you see. So now there's a thick network of organizations. I wouldn't say that that is a movement, but always is a step before a movement. And I think there's a movement for peace, and there's a movement for rights, and an anti-corruption, for transparency that is growing. You see it more in Mexico City. You see it in the northern country, and I presume that we will see more of that.
There was another question. Oh, okay, over here.
Thank you very much. My name's Christiana, and I'm in the Russian East European program. So I'm sure you've heard in Russia, they're also experiencing a little bit of issues with suppression of media. There are a lot of organizations that have moved out of Russia and are operating, for instance, in Latvia, Estonia, attempting to reach the public like that. So how are journalists, alternative journalists in Mexico, reaching their public? Are they leaving Mexico, trying that way, staying in Mexico, and facing what comes, etc.? Yeah, thank you.
In reality, I was talking about two threats, but I would say maybe you can pay the rent, but you can work. I mean, you can open your own media. There are many new platforms that are working, and the more rebels are moving to these new platforms. These platforms are doing the best the investigation. The reporting that you can see in these platforms is extraordinary. Is winning prizes. So if you want to face government, you can do it. The problem is to face organized crime when organized crime is linked to government, to local government. There, most journalists are stopping being journalists. You can keep going if you already say this guy is a drug dealer or drug trafficker. After that your life is really at risk. So many journalists are moving to another job while this changes. And there is nothing that is protecting. We have very good journalism against corruption. But against organized crime, you don't see journalism still. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leticia. I'm from Brazil, and I work in the Iranian Studies department in here. What we're experiencing in Brazil right now, it's a big polarization when it comes to media and journalism, especially because of the corruption that's happening all over the country. So what I want to understand is, in Mexico, because we have this type of media that's more independent and that it's putting people out, and this type of media that's more, I'd say, it's more constrained because of the government, how are people reacting to this? Is it still very polarized, or they know that one side is clearly being manipulated by the other?
What is interesting is I was talking about this $5 billion poured into the traditional media. So what you will see is traditional media very close to government. And on the other hand, news in the web and social networks are very against government. So there is a real polarization between traditional media and new news media. Young people are looking for information in the new media. Old people, or my generation, are looking in the traditional one. And what you see is exactly, as you described, a big polarization. There is nothing in the middle. And polls are very eloquent. And the virtual city promotes radicalization or extremist positions. So it's very difficult to build democracy when there is no common ground. And this is a very difficult moment because we don't find the common ground. But if I found today a new media, if I put it in the middle and I sell products for you, news for you, I can't do it with common ground positions because that doesn't sell. So this is a very big problem. Why government is pouring so much money in the traditional media? Because they want to face the news media or the new media. How does that, or did that work badly? 75% of the population is against the actual government. So traditional media doesn't work to legitimate nothing. So we will see what happens after this government. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit. What?
No, you are for the rest.
Oh, sorry. My name's Anna Karen. I'm a master's student in the Latin American Studies program. And so we talked a little bit at our table about the challenges that come with social media as like a means of like news dissemination. And then you also mentioned in your talk like the lack of consensus around like what the truth is. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on like whether like fake news is like we think about it here in the U.S. is a similar issue in Mexico in the upcoming election. Like, do you think it'll be like a similar problem like it was in the 2016 election here? And just like generally, yeah, just more of your thoughts on this like lack of truth consensus and how potential ways to address that.
I think what you lead here help us a lot. When we started this electoral period, in Mexico we were very worried about fake news because we saw what happened here. And I always need to explain what fake news I understand by, because something is false news, but fabricated news deliberately to cheat on people is something different. So I'm talking about this kind of fake news. We see fake news, but for example, there is something now called Verify 18. It's young people, younger than you, or more or less, that are on charge of verifying news all the time and in a wiki way. So, well, this is López Obrador, one of the candidates, mounting on his Ferrari, and suddenly, well, this is a fake photo, etc. So the antibodies, the reaction, the vaccine is working. And I am surprised, but fake news are not the main issue now. Fake news done by a young guy saying that FBI agent committed suicide and he was working on the Hillary Clinton investigation. This kind of guy, the things doesn't work. But what happened at the same time is that the government is doing fake news. And that's a problem, because fake news done by the government and published through the traditional media, that's a big problem. I mean, this is a different kind of thing that we are seeing now.
Hi, I'm Anubha. I'm a graduate student in the Department of History here. I study India. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on the role of judiciary and how judiciary, or whether judiciary is intervening in these reported crimes, in the murders of journalists. Thank you.
The problem is not a bad judiciary system for journalists. We have a bad judiciary system, period. It's very political still. I mean, our prosecutors, they are political actors. The main, I mean, torture is still there. technicalities that you need for a good process. We don't have it. We don't have capabilities among prosecutors and among judges because the old system kept justice as a political thing for the president and for governors. Now we are facing a reform to the judiciary system to give autonomy to the prosecutor, and hopefully that's going to change the judiciary system at the federal level and then at the local level. And this is one of the main issues on the campaign. I mean, discussing, we have the presidential debate on Sunday, and the question that every journalist is expecting is how the candidates look at this judicial reform. But if you ask me, Ricardo, which is the main reform that Mexico has to do, they want to the judicial system. Overall, at the local level, 80% of the cases are at the local level. We need to do a major surgery there. Yeah. Another one on that same
Um,
table.
so I'm Gülin, I'm from Turkey, and we have similar problems to the country with most jailed journalists, but anyway. So my question is about the freedom of association, because freedom of association, I was wondering if Mexican people face trust from government on while they are protesting and associating in face of these corruptions as well, because when we used Twitter, for example, to associate and to demonstrate, the government blocked Twitter, and that was their way of fighting freedom of association. And I was wondering if that happened in Mexico as well.
I am from a generation that was born in a very protective country, protectionist in the trade and isolated. And I remember when we started to change back in the 90s, I was studying in France, and a teacher told me, Turkey and Mexico are going to be the winners of globalization. Well, we are the winners like it is. I mean, we have almost all the problems of advantageous countries and all the problems of disadvantageous countries. I mean, we are both. So I congratulate you for being Turkish, and I can understand quite well what you're saying. We have had a big problem with espionage. I mean, what now know is that our government has very good spies over civil society leaders. There is a program called Pegasus. And if you don't have the Pegasus worm in your mobile, you are not worthy in Mexican society, because it's incredible what they did. And what happened is they took this, for example, for journalists, they don't use your information. They use the information of your sources. If I call a guy in Guerrero to tell me what is going on there, okay, I don't know if they spy on me, but what is true is that this guy, this source in Guerrero, gonna fight something terrible. So on the other hand, we have problem of prestige or reputation. Is, for example, for the case of the students in Guerrero that disappear, the guys that were doing the research, all the investigation, suddenly their lives were in front pages of different journals, things that were all horrible, fake news. So you don't see the old style against freedom of organization, of freedom of association. You don't see the army or the police going to your house. It's more subtle, but it works because you feel timid after being spy or after seeing your life in the front page. Yeah.
Let me take probably one more question. Any takers? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I'm Catherine. I'm a junior studying international relations and human rights. Increasingly in the United States, it seems there's more distrust of the media amongst the public. So I was wondering if in Mexico, is there distrust in the media? And just a final question is, what are the consequences of distrust in the media and what could potentially be done?
I just see pools. I would say that universities, church, and the army, they have the highest level on trust. The lowest, mayors, parties, and press. This traditional press. So this is a problem. I mean, the business model is broken, and we are mistrusted. So the only way to survive this old job as journalist is to do better press and better journalism. There's an incentive, big incentive, to get up in this mistrust or trust levels. I think this is a problem that you see everywhere. And I think beside bad or good press, this technological revolution is changing the way to inform yourself, to deliver information. It's like the times where the train arrived for the first time to a very far town that changes everything. Well, social media, internet is changing the way to relate to each other. And we need to learn how to live in this virtual city that exists at the same time that the real city. And it's a learning process. We need to educate ourselves in digital skills, finding the truth, and this is a good thing. This is why I am saying we are seeing the Renaissance. Nothing gonna be like we met before, and I celebrate to be part of this generation that can cross the bridge to the future. It won't be easy. It's not easy, but it's better. And I give this leap of faith and I give it to you. Thank you.
That's the optimism for your son.
Yeah, I wanted to end on that optimistic or aspirational note by saying two things that sort of inspire me tonight. One is the model of courageous speech that you represent, right? So the continuing willingness to push on, to have your voice be heard, to debate in the public sphere, to call attention to the failures of government, the failures of the criminal gangs, the consequences for society. That is courageous speech. And all of our societies benefit from having people who are willing to take the risks that you've taken with your own life. And I can't help but walk away inspired by that example that you demonstrate for us tonight. I'm also inspired in part by the conversation that we had at our table by this group of students, because if there's anything that's important about this moment, it's having a set of active young people who are paying attention to what's happening around the world. And you can see how diverse our student community is. It's from all over the world, people grappling with these kinds of challenges in their own countries, Americans thinking about it in our own country. And ultimately, the ways that we address these challenges are going to start very much with the kind of people who are in this room. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking Ricardo for being with us this evening, for sharing his story, and recognizing the extraordinary leadership you've shown in Mexico and around the world on this set of issues.